So it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Jane Shaw, who's going to preside over the event. Jane is a fellow of Kellogg College, an honorary fellow, as well as being principal of Harris Manchester College, which is the other Oxford college that's dedicated to adult education and lifelong learning. So, Jane, thank you very much.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have you all here for the 2023 Vincent Strudwick Lecture, which is on religion and public life, and of course particularly brilliant to have Vincent himself sitting in the front row. Looking not a day over 60, as always. And it's also my pleasure to thank the main sponsors of this lecture, the Graduate Theological Foundation in the USA. They always, every year, generously sponsor this lecture. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce this year's lecturer, Rupert Shortt, writer, journalist and theologian, former religious editor of the Times Literary Supplement, a post he held from 2000 to 2020. Rupert is now a research associate at the von Hugel Institute at the University of Cambridge, and he's also been, I'm glad to say, a visiting fellow here at Oxford at Blackfriars. He's the author of 9 books, and he's written on a range of religious subjects. What I think Rupert is really able to do is put his finger on the pulse of what questions people have, the real questions that the person in the pew and the person hovering outside the pew are asking. So, for example, in 2019, he published 2 books. One, Outgrowing Dawkins, God for Grown-Ups, and the other, Does Religion Do More Harm Than Good? In 2016, he published God Is No Thing, Coherent Christianity. So you can see he has his finger on the questioning religious pulse. He's published also 2 biographies, Rowan's Rule, the biography of the Archbishop, and Benedict XVI, Commander of the Faith. He's currently working further on Rowan Williams, particularly Rowan Williams's recent philosophical theology. But his most recent book, I'm happy to say, is for sale with the independent bookseller Cole Books, The Hardest Problem, God, Evil and Suffering, published by Hodder and Stratton last year. And that, of course, relates to the subject of his lecture this evening, which is Evil and the God of Love. Welcome, Rupert.
Thank you both for those lovely introductions. I'm very honoured to have been asked to give this lecture, and I'm delighted to have your company. Thank you very much for coming. It is, of course, the question of questions for most believers, let alone countless others, either drawn to religion or repelled by it. Our planet is steeped in suffering and cruelty. If we are lucky or wealthy enough to have avoided first-hand experience of these scourges, they are nevertheless on plain view at 1 or 2 removes from our doorsteps. Yet, various major creeds, especially those of Judaism, Christianity and Islam, teach that the world owes its existence to a creator who is all-loving as well as all-powerful. Standing in a line of thinkers reaching back to Epicurus, David Hume famously sums up the challenge with disarming bluntness. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? If people of faith aren't chastened by Hume's reasoning, they certainly ought to be. Anyone who supposes that a neat answer can be given to so monumental a conundrum has failed to grasp its scale. Serious replies from across the spectrum should therefore be multi-layered and tentative in principle. Caution need not imply confusion or faint-heartedness, however. Here are a few counter-thoughts in brief. Granted, Hume does fire well-aimed darts at what look like religion's weak flanks. We should hardly expect less from a father of modern atheism. But what about his own soft underbelly? If all God talk is based on a mirage, then life has no ultimate meaning whatever. And is that drastic inference fair or over hasty? The heart of the matter lies here, I would suggest, one stage back in the argument. In other words, we will make little progress in discussing God, evil and suffering without engaging the prior question of whether the world has a creator and therefore presumably a goal. Many wisdom traditions answer with a resounding yes. In headline terms, they tell us that nature is not only discordant on some levels, it also makes sense, interlocks, hangs together. Viewed as a whole, it can be justly described as more harmony than chaos, which is why a scientist as distinguished as Freeman Dyson can write that, quote, "To worship God means to recognise that mind and intelligence are woven into the fabric of our universe in a way that altogether passes our comprehension," unquote. Several vital forms of awareness may be inferred from this. One holds that we should move through the world in somewhat the same way as we move about in someone else's home, noticing that we are guests and someone else is the host. Another, that the purpose or end of our time on earth is moral growth. A specifically Christian framework has been honed as follows. Human beings are organisms with natural capacities and needs. The attainment of those needs and capacities is happiness, in a sense widely accepted across periods and cultures. Happiness, though, also implies an element played down in secular thought, often, namely self-sacrificial love. Hardship will certainly strike along the way, but endurance is a spur to salvation in a longer perspective, both in time and beyond time. Jesus taught us much before living out what he preached. These themes resonate yesterday and today in the example set by a cloud of witnesses inside and outside the visible church. Allied ideas can be found in other global faiths, in Judaism and Islam, in Sikhism, in Bhaktic and Vedantic Hinduism. How viable in turn are these principles, or any of the roots they spring from, given the equally bracing comment of Hume's precursor, Thomas Hobbes, that life for most people existing without effective forms of government has been nasty, brutish and short, to say nothing of the pain endured by other creatures during the eons before and after the arrival of Homo sapiens. Hobbesians may insist that chaos, philosophical as much as practical, describes our situation all too accurately. They could support their view that life has no final purpose by pointing out that history itself seems to lack any rhyme or reason. Injecting Hobbes's comments with metaphysical significance, or rather, lack of it, Richard Dawkins has argued that there is no good or evil, quote, just blind, pitiless indifference, unquote. If correct, this nostrum must apply at all biological levels. The only law reflected in what we call civilization is that of the jungle, on this view. Now, we should note in passing that Dawkins has drawn heavy criticism from fellow scientists, let alone others, for describing genes as selfish. Nature displays cooperation as well as competition. In telling us about harmony and relationship at the quantum level, say, or that of the cell, it is very much disciplines like physics and physiology which these days employ concepts far removed from those of the Victorian rationalists and their modern successors who think of matter as no more than meaningless bits of stuff. So-called objective commentators sometimes forget that apparently blind physical forces have, as a matter of fact, given rise to the Taj Mahal and Bach's B minor Mass. Freeman Dyson's remark therefore commands respect. But suppose we reserve judgment for now about the theological implications, if any, of science. Maybe history, at least, supports Hobbes. Absorb any solid study of earlier eras and you will appreciate the precarious conditions endured by the lion's share of humanity at most times. The precariousness naturally persists for several billion souls today. So where then is God to be found in an arena where people die in pain and apparently pointlessly through disease or poverty or violence? Classical monotheism has tended to offer two responses to suffering and evil in turn. First, it is said, pain cannot be avoided where physical laws have their own integrity. A material world involves inbuilt constraints. St. Thomas Aquinas observes that things exist by surviving, namely winning the favour of their environments. But there is no chance of harvesting all that benefit at once without any associated rupture. In Aquinas' view, the universe as a whole is better for including some things that cease to survive. Fire must consume air in order to burn. Deer must eat saplings. A tiger's good is a buffalo's evil. There are ways of improving the situation so as to be more even-handed, but to have the universe without any of this destruction is impossible. Aquinas adds candidly that as a result of bringing about world order and harmony, God indirectly causes natural evils and afflictions. Not even divine omnipotence can generate a finite cosmos in which natural evils will not be a concomitant of good. Knowing this, God chose to create, so can be held responsible for natural evils. Suppose we had the omnipotence, however. Would we decide to destroy life because of those concomitant evils? The answer for Aquinas is no. Therefore, blaming God is not viable. The true course for us is to accept our environment and assume our own responsibility, our own share of the responsibility, for it. We could try taking on one of the main tasks for which Genesis suggests Adam and Eve were made, to tend and cherish the earth as good stewards. Evil is also considered unavoidable in a setting where flawed human beings are free to become better or worse. When the renowned Jewish thinker Jonathan Sacks confronted the question of where God was at Auschwitz, he said that God had been there, quotes, in the words, "You shall not murder." He was there in the words, "Do not oppress the stranger." In the words, "Your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground," unquote. Rabbi Sacks immediately added that the Holocaust was not in and of itself a new challenge to faith. Exactly the same question could have been asked about Cain and Abel, among innumerable other disasters. And he adds, why did God let Cain kill his brother? And the truth is, that is the Jewish equation. We believe that God gave us freedom. It is the most fateful decision he made in the entire universe. Freedom means that if we do well, we are little lower than the angels. But if we do bad, we are lower even than the beasts. That is our world. God teaches what's good and what's evil, what we should do and what we should not do. But God does not intervene to force us to do good or to prevent us from doing evil. And incidentally, in the talk concerned, Sachs went on to voice some highly astringent conclusions relevant to our main theme, and I would like to share them with you. There was one sense, he says, in which the Holocaust did change the whole human equation. The culture that produced the Holocaust was not distant. This colossal tragedy and crime took place in the heart of the most civilized culture that the world had ever known. A culture that had achieved the greatest heights of human achievement in science, in philosophy, in rationalism. This was the culture of Kant and Hegel and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, the culture of Goethe and Schiller and Bach and Beethoven. Half the signatories of the Wannsee Declaration, authorising the so-called final solution from 1942, carried the title of doctor, he says. And that was just Germany. France, the country that gave us the revolution and the rights of man, had an astonishing history of anti-Semitism. As for Vienna, the cultural capital of Europe, was also the epicenter of anti-Semitism. After the Holocaust, says Sachs, some people lost their faith. Some people kept their faith, and some people found faith in God. But after the Holocaust, it is morally impossible to believe in man. The Holocaust is the final, decisive refutation of the idea that you can have a humane civilization without fear of heaven and without belief in the sanctity of life. The Holocaust may make some lose their faith in God, but it must make all people lose their faith in man. After Auschwitz, you have to be either very ignorant or very naive to believe in secular humanism. The real challenge of the Shoah, he concludes, is not to faith, but to lack of faith. Now, the factors set out so far point, I would suggest, to a provisional conclusion. Morally self-aware individuals and societies should strive tooth and nail to avert evils with human causes. A gargantuan crime such as the Holocaust should, of course, never have happened. On the other hand, even if our politics were vastly less toxic, that would hardly guarantee us a pain-free existence from cradle to grave. Not only would we still face the effects of illness and accidents, there would also be unavoidable emotional suffering, which may be the price we pay for progress towards maturity and big-heartedness. Here is a theme to run with for anyone drawn to religion, Abrahamic monotheism especially. Among the virtues of Eleanor Stump's monumental work, Wandering in Darkness, is the author's willingness to tackle suffering at a psychological narrative level rather than just focusing on more abstract generalities. Concentrating on biblical examples, she points to how one person after another, Abraham, Samson, Job, Mary of Bethany, is enlarged by challenging ordeals. Now, let me stress, Stump is not claiming that God deliberately inflicted pain on these figures. She grasps the problem with so-called soul-making approaches to suffering, which imply that our lives are neat obstacle courses designed to evince ever greater ethical progress. Peddling that message to people facing all manner of tribulation would be contemptible in my view. But by presenting spiritual rather than philosophical arguments, Professor Stump in Wandering in Darkness opens a door for individuals to put their own stamp on their experience. Mary and Martha pray for Lazarus to be saved, yet he dies. That tragedy serves to deepen relations between the sisters and Christ before their brother is raised. Samson brings suffering on himself in some sense, but has a redemptive experience at the end of his life. On regaining his strength, he prays properly for the first time, as opposed to making demands or seeking to glorify himself. Narrative arguments like these are powerful for the very reason that they are not saying God is bringing about such and such a person's good and that's why they are facing torment. Instead, Stump's presentation allows a person to recognise that his or her circumstances can in the end be put in a good context. The heart's desires can be reconfigured or refolded. Seeds of hope can take root. This is not meant to take away from what Stump calls the execrable and lamentable nature of suffering. But she nevertheless argues that, quote, the change made by encompassing all the desires of a person's heart within a deeper desire for God works a transformation not only as regards the character of the heartbreak over the loss of other heart's desires, but also as regards the very nature of the loss and the possibilities for the redemption of it. To sum up, dire statistics about pain do not point ineluctably towards religious skepticism or atheism alone. Illness or trauma can be interpreted in different ways. Several years ago, I lost a very dear friend to stomach cancer. Richly productive in several spheres, he also enjoyed good health until his mid-80s. By contrast, his aunt had had a catastrophic stroke in her youth, leaving her paralysed for the remaining 6 decades of her life. She nevertheless lived and died a Christian. Eva Kor, a Jewish survivor of Auschwitz, later befriended and forgave her ex-Nazi guard, describing the experience as immensely liberating. But what are the vast quantities of undeserved suffering, whether arising from illness, accident or iniquity, that are not and cannot be a gateway to spiritual refinement? An acquaintance of mine was repeatedly raped as a schoolboy. The book of Revelation talks of a time when God will wipe away all tears. Yet in many eyes, there is no imaginable settling of spiritual accounts that will ever make things right for someone violated in childhood. Deepening this quandary from the fictional realm, Ivan Karamazov famously asks whether the agonizing death of a child torn limb from limb by dogs would be an acceptable price for the bliss of everyone else. Many would accept his protestation that such a price is too high. Are we then simply left with a stalemate involving subjective assessments as to whether levels of strife and evil are either unacceptable, perhaps grotesquely so, or as high as they need to be in a material world containing autonomous agents such as ourselves? This is the mire into which discussion of theodicy, that's the business of providing morally sufficient reasons God has for allowing suffering, this is the business in which discussion of this subject can all too easily slip. When less self-aware Christians give implausible or insensitive explanations of pain in terms of divine punishment or the inscrutable will of God, or frustrated atheists direct anger at God for not intervening and sometimes for not existing, it is clear that patient sifting at various levels of understanding is called for. In seeking to clear the ground, I want to outline an answer to Ivan Karamazov in a bit more detail, while also conceding its limits. One vital point is that granting the incompleteness of an argument should not be seen as implying that it lacks worth. If we bring a model derived from a computer program or the computer sciences to the problem of pain, we will end up in trouble. If, on the other hand, someone engaging with the subject says that he or she has certain core beliefs and an intimation of how they might hang together, or certain tools that seem productive in what will probably be an abiding quest, then perhaps this path will be far more appropriate to the matter in hand. A more general insight set out by Aristotle is germane. It is the mark of an educated person, he says, to require in every field as much certainty as the nature of the matter allows. Only juveniles suppose that assurance about everything can be fully arrived at using quasi-mathematical tools and proofs. He would have applauded the adage that the opposite of faith is not doubt, the opposite of faith is certainty. And from our own vantage point, we could add that these days the fundamentalists stand not on one side of the religious-secular divide, but on both. Does the landscape perhaps look a little different in this light? Well, only the chronically insensitive, namely those wedded to an arithmetical model of doing things, suppose that horrors including the slave trade, the caste system, and the gulag can ever be retrospectively vindicated in a straightforward way. The same applies to the death from dysentery of a baby in Africa today. Pain is not God's megaphone to the world, in the notorious expression, later taken back, of C.S. Lewis. Once more, there is a limit in principle to what can be achieved by rationalistic discourse. The ground on which the argument develops is far more likely to be moral and practical to a very high degree. It can never be circumvented by logic alone. Ask reflective Jews, Christians, or Muslims how to square the circle, and they are likely to insist that the resources of faith do not provide a demonstrative solution to questions about the volume of suffering in the world, but rather a resolve never to abandon the way of love. They may also say that there remains a place for muscular philosophical reasoning in appropriate contexts, side by side with other approaches. To start with, it is essential to know what the three Abrahamic faiths say about God's standing vis-à-vis the world. Classical theism does not picture God as a director, still less an engineer or watchmaker, as deists and some Christians influenced by deism hold, who wound up a spring and retreated to let creation take care of itself. Adjusting the analogy, God is not another powerful piece on the chessboard or a character in our human drama, but more like an author in relation to his or her characters, namely on a different plane altogether. That means creation is held to be going on here and now, not in the sense that the world requires constant tinkering from on high, material reality has its own coherence, described by the laws of physics. I'm quite clear about that. But because God holds everything in being moment by moment at a deeper level. Among the implications of these tenets are that God is therefore not observing us from a distance, ruminating on whether or not to get closer. Divine involvement in creation is already deeper and more intimate than we can imagine. While activated by God, however, the world is different from him, hence our free will, and as indicated, what is not God will by definition be subject to imperfection, decay, collision, conflict. Viewing their respective doctrines in the round, believers can infer that God's role is neither to cause tragedy nor to resolve it by our own canons of resolution. God's relation to strife lies rather in the resources God offers for transfiguring it and taking it forward. I have already noted that a world containing self-conscious creatures like ourselves is probably hard to conceive without moral as well as natural evil. It could also be argued that human beings are only fully free in their relations with their Creator if their existence and that of the universe is fully causally explicable through the resources of science. From such a perspective, evolution is God's way of conferring that freedom. So benign teleology, if it exists, cannot mean that God fixes things in order that everything works out for the best. The believer already knows that times without number in the history of humanity, terrible earthquakes, tsunamis, plagues, famines, wars, and all manner of other disasters have struck, killing, maiming, destroying lives, and God does nothing to stop them. This may seem too obvious to need stating, but sometimes stating the obvious can help to draw our attention to what is lost sight of through familiarity with the moves and counter-moves of intellectual debate. For instance, if teleology precludes magic one-style deliverance, it might mean that all things created by God have a final objective, or that their true destiny is to seek the good. And this, so people of faith could add, is already more than the atheist or materialist is prepared or entitled to say. Sometimes, as we know, individuals deliberately turn away from the quest, and sometimes through no fault of their own, they are prevented by misfortune or disease or natural disaster from pursuing or even embarking on that quest. But again, we already know that many entities in the biological world do not, for various reasons, reach their goals. Church teaching has tended to harness the argument in ways already hinted at. First, by a suggestion that there is some similarity between the divine love which knows self-conscious existence to be a precious gift that can only be bought at a price, and the love of parents who conceive a child knowing perfectly well that they are bringing her or him into a broken world and exposing their daughter or son to risks over which they will have no control. Mothers and fathers choose life because they believe in its possibilities. Second, Christians invoke fundamental articles of faith. A potent answer to the waste and suffering entailed by evolution is the presence of God incarnate, experiencing the joys, sorrows, injustices, and mortality that we all face. It is a commonplace that Christians do not merely believe God to be great or transcendent. They hold that God transcended his transcendence by taking off his crown to share our flesh. God was rejected by humankind on the cross, but made of that rejection an example of divine humility. Another biblical theme follows on from this. God's creative process, which began by bringing something out of nothing, will end with the deliverance of everything and everyone out of the nothingness of sin and death into perfection. St. Paul plainly had no access to Darwin's discoveries, but was well aware that suffering, death and decay were part of creation, and he did not shy away from the idea that God was responsible for that reality. The matter is encapsulated in Romans 8, 20-21. The creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For futility, one could substitute evolution by natural selection, I would suggest. Now, it will have become clear over the past few sentences that Christians and others may question the harmony-chaos binary as a sort of false alternative. This stance need not for a moment preclude a sombre outlook on the world. To the contrary, even though its pessimism about human nature is ultimately eclipsed by hope, a Christian perspective should be sombre as well as joyful. Think among many other examples of W.H. Auden's remark that the scale of human self-delusion appears to be so enormous that the task of mending it amounts to a matter of life and death. It is Christians, but not in this case Jews and Muslims, who believe in original sin. You do not need to take Genesis 1-3 literally to sense that humanity is flawed. The Roman Catholic thinker Herbert McCabe's trenchant summary of Jesus' example speaks for itself. If you don't love, you're dead, and if you do, they'll kill you. Furthermore, it is very much this sombre framework that supplies a spur to action and explains the Church's status as the preeminent global source of social capital. A pastor once put matters to me as follows: maybe the Christian standpoint is only the second most difficult, and the atheists the most problematic of all. At least, he said, I as a Christian can see acute suffering and howl with indignation, recognizing that something is terribly wrong. He added that the way forward lies in openness to the presence of God in Christ, mediated in profoundly practical ways through the church, which is his body. To me, he added, that is a less unsatisfactory answer than Richard Dawkins's comment that there is no evil, just blind, pitiless indifference. In other words, there is one option worse than saying, here's an unsquarable circle, which is, what's a square? What's a circle in the first place? Have we moved too far at this sort of halfway stage towards the province of dogma in the popular derogatory sense? Well, perhaps the answer is yes and no. As I suggested, if you ask Christians to explain their picture of God in relation to a broken world, it would be odd not to receive an answer based on the Christian narrative and its Jewish backstory. When atheist tub thumpers and their celebrity fans vent anger on the subject of an all-powerful but apparently indifferent deity, we can note that the protest reflects compassionate awareness and demands the most considered response possible, but also that it may be based on ill-informed assumptions about a capricious wand waver in the sky. once more, if your picture of God involves someone who rips apart the fabric of creation to fiddle with it, then you have an insuperable problem, in my view. I don't believe in such a figure. Now, I'm conscious I've opened up many questions there, and in my book, The Hardest Problem, I actually take a step right back to ask about the coherence of belief in God at a conceptual level, and unfortunately there isn't time today to delve into that. And equally plainly, a book like this needs to go into considerably more detail about what it means to claim that Jesus died for the sins of the world, and why a Christian should see that as a game changer. There is perhaps in a slightly different register, more that of the sermon than the piece of more academic analysis. I read a beautiful pithy answer recently from Sam Wells, the vicar of St Martin in the Fields, who's fully entitled to talk in this way, given that he's a man of the cloth. And he says, the problem of suffering assumes that God's role is to bring health and flourishing. And if God fails to do that, God is malign or weak. But what if God's role is to be with us always, in person in Jesus, in myriad ways through the Holy Spirit, and forever in heaven? God is not an instrument we discard if it malfunctions. God is the essence of all things, who astonishingly chooses to be with us even in desperate hardship, and even in the crucified Christ in the indescribable agony. That does not make suffering go away, but it turns God's engagement with suffering from a reason for rejection into a reason for worship. Now, in my book, as I say, I talk at a rather different register about the historical background to Jesus's ministry, and I go into an explanation of some of the terms used in the New Testament at a time when Christian doctrine is sort of being hammered out, and the early Christians are living, if you like, in the aftermath of a spiritual earthquake. I won't talk about that in any detail today. I hope if you're interested in getting hold of a copy of the book that you will look at that. But there are two things that I feel I would be shortchanging you on if I didn't address, and one is the subject of divine action, answered prayer and miracle, and the other is the question of providence. So I think quite a lot of what I've said so far has been leading up to some thoughts about how we might conceive of divine action. And I note in my book that Augustine believed that even if knowing and loving God face to face is impossible without divine grace, the capacity to know and love God does exist in human nature. And Aquinas, who's also influenced me a lot in this regard, sees an analogy for this process in the workings of the ocean. Its nature, that's to say the sea, the water in the ocean, is not exhausted by its physics and chemistry. The ocean is also defined by its place on Earth under solar and lunar influences. The ocean cannot ebb and flow of itself, suggests the Aquinas scholar Timothy McDermott, but its nature allows it to respond to its partners, sun and moon. In the same way, the human being, because endowed with reason, is of its nature open to God, able to be moved by God to friendship, and disposed by God to a life of love in common with him. And the way God does this, of course, from a Christian standpoint, is through the personal life of Jesus of Nazareth. To sum up then, finite agency is open to possibilities rooted in infinite agency rather than just its own immanent, predictable capacities. Here I think we have a hint of what developed monotheism understands by revelation. The world remains the world. Finite causes remain finite causes. God does not tear apart the fabric of creation to insert his word into it. But as human agents made in the image of God arrange themselves around the magnetic attraction of the infinite, the movement uncovers something of God's nature and self-communication. These ideas, I think, may in turn clarify some more self-aware understandings of intercessory prayer. Petition of this kind is not fundamentally about asking God to sort out a problem that is beyond the capacity of you or me to resolve. As I understand it, people who pray are seeking to open their lives to enough of God's love for a difference to be made. They are trying to become a conduit for a healing purpose. The result can therefore be practical. For instance, through praying more for the situations in Syria, Ukraine or Venezuela, I may become involved with giving or campaigning in a more concerted way. If that is not viable, then, in the words of a preacher I once heard, the Christian makes the bold assumption, as do those of other faiths, that just opening one's mind and heart to a given source of need somehow brings into the world something of God's action and God's freedom, which can in principle make a difference. And that is plainly why again and again in the midst of trauma, believers seek to connect the horrors experienced by themselves or others with the love of God. In the process, they become the place at which two dimensions intersect. A Christian can thus describe prayer without melodrama as part of the way in which he or she shares God's governance of the world. The practice changes us, believers may say. It makes us spiritually less calloused and more perceptive to suffering, meaning maybe we can do more about it when it strikes. We realise that there probably isn't going to be a sudden change. Nevertheless, we know that what we're doing is important and efficacious, an obligation that's laid upon us. That is an act of hope with political significance. Now, perhaps in the light of what I've just said, a window can be opened on understandings of miracle in the tradition that I'm describing. Prayer is, of course, normative for a believer in the way that miracles are not. But, equally clearly, orthodoxy includes a belief in uncommon forms of divine action, held in certain cases to be responses to prayer. When I asked Rowan Williams to expound his understanding of this subject, he proposed that we imagine certain circumstances in which the action of God in relation to the world may be that much closer to the surface than usual. And he said, we may not be able to understand what the rule of that is, but if what is sustaining every reality is the energy, the action of God, then is it so difficult to believe that from God's point of view, and not ours, there are bits of the universal order where the fabric is thinner, where the coming together of certain conditions makes it possible for the action of God to be a little more transparent. And when we talk about miracle, he added, it's that. Williams, I think, means that the world is such that when certain prayers are prayed, a door is open for divine action to act irregularly, to act in a way you would not, from the rest of the picture, have expected. The model acquires greater texture given a prior conviction, as I say, that the divine energy and glory are always pretty near the surface of our world, and in certain circumstances, very close indeed to the surface. It needs adding that miracles can be detected in the perception of events. Mainstream Christians can affirm belief in the objective reality of miracles while also drawing attention to someone who has recovered from addiction via a 12-step program, for example. I myself have a more intuitive sense of a miracle when someone surmounts a disaster in that way than in occurrences that are less easy to explain. But this remains compatible with the principle that the energy of God, constantly bubbling up beneath the surface of life, can sometimes so seep into the actions of women and men that possibilities we might never have imagined come to fruition. Elements of what is always present at the corner of our vision come centre stage. At root, then, if we are seeking to understand, develop teaching on miracles in the Abrahamic faiths, we must remind ourselves over and again that the relation between uncreated and created reality does not rest on presuppositions about a neat distance between God and ourselves. There is both total difference and yet not a distance. Total difference and yet not a distance. So many questions in theodicy and the philosophy of religion more widely come down in the end to different models or, if you like, grammars of causality, in that if our understanding of divine and human agency is antagonistic or competitive, then fundamentally we're left with a problem. Whereas if creatures are held to be nested within the divine causality, then a very different model becomes available. It doesn't dissolve all these challenges, but they do, I think, take on a new structure. Lastly, a few remarks about Providence, which was always a subject that had troubled me quite a lot, especially before researching this book. How can it, despite everything I've said, how can it be claimed that a good purpose is being worked out through all of history? From a Christian vantage point, and building on my very brief comments about atonement, the most important thing to say is that such a purpose will always have a Christ-like character. God's plans will involve crosses as well as hosannas and resurrections. And developments that on the face of it appear purely negative or meaningless may not do so in hindsight. Our crosses may ultimately show their good purpose if seen in a larger context, both within and beyond time. But that perspective in turn may depend on still to be realised eschatology. The life of Jesus bears out the claim. His first 3 decades were mostly spent under the radar as far as we know. His 3-year ministry ended in failure as well as a scandalous death. Christians, let alone non-believers, are often among the first to grant that the resurrection and the descent of the Spirit at Pentecost represent definitive but still partial manifestations of God's purpose in time. In the Gospels, Jesus asks pointedly whether the Son of Man will find faith filling the earth on his return. The answer to this rhetorical question is, of course, negative. He will find only sporadic signs of the kingdom, wars and rumours of wars, and wheat mixed with tares. We discover what can be called figural or associative understandings of providence across the theological spectrum, from Origen in the 3rd century to Karl Barth and Hans Frey in the 20th. According to this way of thinking, disasters and other evils may appear irreducibly bad in linear terms. Crosses will always be crosses in some eyes. But if we are able to look laterally at events that don't have an obvious connection and then triangulate them with Christ's passion and conquest of death, a purpose may indeed emerge. In the Hebrew Bible, formative episodes such as Passover, Exodus, and the return from exile occur far apart in time. Their significance was and remains disputed. Yet by comparing them laterally and triangulating them with the example of Christ, their purpose may become clearer. As Vernon White, who has done quite a lot of work on providence, says, we may see the family resemblance, the common identity of one common underlying actor fulfilling a common purpose. The events cry out that God's hand is at work in this, the same liberating and redeeming God, working the specific purpose of liberation through them all, including the setbacks and crosses. Providence is not made manifest by attempts to identify it at every point between the careers of Moses and Jesus, so that all the dots can be joined straightforwardly. The pattern, White adds, emerges precisely in figural and lateral connections. Quote, and it is the power of these sorts of recurring patterns in particular events that gives us a confidence. First, confidence that there will be a completion of this purpose, if not linearly in history, then in eternity. Second, confidence that all other events are also being drawn into that pattern, if only we had a wider perspective to see it. Such figural patterns of events may appear in our personal experience too, not just in big biblical events, to reinforce this confidence. And I think it could be added that a clear link exists between the pattern recognition of which Vernon White writes and the operations of grace. The story of Joseph in the Hebrew Bible provides a splendid example of this. Hindsight bearing fruit in insight, but only because Joseph's experiences, some highly alarming, have seen him receptive to grace. Now, in conclusion, due caveats are essential. One is that some evils remain incomprehensible in this life, regardless of the resources identified in my talk. But that is because someone experiencing unresolved pain will be conscious above all of the psychological dimension. Christians and others may nevertheless be able to say without cant that the reality to which faith points means that suffering will be experienced differently sub specie eternitatis. Another proviso concerns the danger of identifying providential signs in this or that public event with too much confidence. No such certainty is available to us given the inherent mysteriousness of figural rather than linear readings of history. Calvin, laid great stress on the importance of what he called secret providence, the full meaning of which would only emerge beyond time, he thought. Yet, being tentative should not preclude hope, I would argue. Christians cannot talk of the end of history in the naive sense employed by Francis Fukuyama in his book of that title, a generation or so ago. A faith that God is working his purpose out, even when it seems cloudy to us, should, as we have seen, sustain an interest in events, an ethic of responsibility, and a resolve to steer a course between despair and triumphalism. Vernon White grants that a thin theology of progress, seeming to offer much, will supply little nourishment when dashed by events. He deserves the last word. Quote, "We need a richer and thicker theology, a Christ-shaped and figural providence will feed a sustainable praxis and life, one which is humbly realistic, but also confident that God is involved in our history, always inviting us to find his purpose through it, even when events turn against us." Unquote. Thank you very much.